Think you know Custer's last stand? Trust me, the real horror was way beyond anything you've imagined. Picture this. Just 215 American soldiers going up against nearly 2,500 Indigenous warriors. What actually went down on that Montana hillside? Your history books conveniently left out the full story. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a systematic annihilation, so horrifying, the U.S. government has actively buried the truth for over 150 years. In under 60 minutes, every single soldier under Custer's direct command was dead. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the real story of Little Bighorn has been deliberately kept out of our history. The truth is far more disturbing than you can possibly imagine. Picture this. It's June 25, 1876. The Montana sun is blazing hot. A U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, cocky, reckless, already half legend, is sitting on a horse at the top of a ridge, staring down at a massive native village stretching along the Little Bighorn River. He's supposed to wait. He's supposed to coordinate. He was literally given orders not to attack yet. He attacks anyway. And within less than an hour, he and every single man who rode with him that day, 210 soldiers, are dead. That's not the crazy part. The crazy part? Nobody in the U.S. Army actually knows what happened. There are no survivors from Custer's direct battalion. No eyewitnesses on the Army side. Just a hill covered in bodies, a few terrified horses, and the biggest military embarrassment the United States had seen in decades. What actually went down on that ridge? How did the most famous cavalryman in America ride straight into a catastrophe? And why does the story we've been told for 150 years leave out so much of what made this battle genuinely horrifying? Let's get into it. Before we get to the battle, you need to understand Custer, because he is one of the most complicated, deeply contradictory figures in all of American history. George Armstrong Custer graduated last in his class at West Point. Dead last, out of 34 cadets. And while he was there, he racked up more demerits than almost anyone in the school's history. Basically, he was that guy who was simultaneously charming enough to get away with everything and reckless enough to constantly push his luck. But then the Civil War happened, and something clicked. Custer was fearless in a way that bordered on insane. He had this almost supernatural ability to read cavalry battles, when to charge, when to hold, when to bluff. And he did it all while wearing these wild, self-designed uniforms with gold lace and a red scarf. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be remembered. And it worked. By age 23, he was a brevet major general, the youngest in U.S. history. He was a celebrity. Newspapers called him the Boy General. He had a fan club. He wrote his own memoir. He married Elizabeth Bacon, who would spend the rest of her life, literally until 1933, protecting and polishing his legacy. After the Civil War, Custer was assigned to fight in the Great Plains against Native American tribes. And this is where the story gets dark. Because out west, Custer wasn't just aggressive, he was brutal. In 1868, he led the attack on a sleeping Cheyenne village on the Washita River. He killed warriors, women, children. He had the village's 800 horses slaughtered so the tribe couldn't survive the winter. He then left the battlefield without retrieving some of his own men who were still out there, men who were later found dead. His own soldiers were furious. But back home, he was a hero again. This is the man who rode toward the Little Bighorn in the summer of 1876. Famous, arrogant, politically motivated, and about to make the worst decision of his career. To understand why the Battle of the Little Bighorn happened, you have to understand what was going on in the American West in the 1870s. And honestly, once you do, the whole thing hits different. The U.S. government had signed the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868, a legal agreement, signed and sealed, that guaranteed the Lakota, Sioux, and their allies ownership of the Black Hills of South Dakota. Forever. Sacred land. The U.S. literally promised. Then, in 1874, Custer himself led an expedition into the Black Hills, and his men found gold. Within months, gold miners were flooding into native territory. The government, rather than honoring the treaty, tried to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota said no. And instead of respecting that, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum. All Lakota had to report to reservations by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. It was winter in South Dakota, with no transportation infrastructure. It was physically impossible for many bands to comply in time, and everyone knew it. So when the deadline passed and thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho people were deemed hostile, the Army launched a major military campaign to force them onto reservations. 3 columns converging from different directions into Montana Territory. But here's what the Army didn't know or chose to ignore. Word had spread among the tribes. Sitting Bull, one of the most respected spiritual and political leaders in Lakota history, had called for a massive gathering. People came from hundreds of miles away. By June 1876, somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 native people were camped along the Little Bighorn River. Maybe 2,000 to 3,000 of them were warriors, many of them battle-hardened, many of them armed with Winchester repeating rifles that were actually better than the Army's Springfield carbines. This wasn't a scattered band of refugees. This was an army. Sitting Bull had been doing something spiritually significant in the weeks leading up to the battle. He participated in a sun dance, an intense, physically demanding ceremony, and during it, he had a vision. He saw soldiers falling from the sky like grasshoppers, upside down, into the village. He told his people, "These soldiers are coming, and we will defeat them." The warriors were ready. General Alfred Terry's plan was actually somewhat reasonable, at least on paper. 3 columns would converge on the area where scouts believed the large native encampment was located. The idea was to surround the tribes so they couldn't escape, then force their surrender. Custer and the 7th Cavalry were supposed to swing around to the south and block any retreat, while Terry and another column came from the north. Nobody was supposed to attack until everyone was in position. Custer had roughly 700 men. He also had options. Terry offered him additional troops, including Gatling guns. Custer turned them down. He said they'd slow him down. He was also offered the use of a battalion from another regiment. He turned that down too. He wanted the 7th Cavalry to have the glory alone. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's Crow and Arikra scouts climbed to a high point called the Crow's Nest and spotted dust and what appeared to be a massive village in the valley below. They urged caution. They told Custer this was more warriors than they had ever seen gathered in one place. Custer reportedly couldn't see what they were describing. He had terrible eyesight, but that might not have mattered anyway, because at almost the exact same moment, he received word that some of his supply packs had been found by Lakota warriors. The element of surprise Custer believed was gone. He had to attack now, before the village scattered. This reasoning was flawed in multiple ways. The village wasn't going anywhere. They had no idea the army was that close yet. And even if they did scatter, catching scattered bands across hundreds of miles of plains was standard army operating procedure. There was no real reason to panic. But Custer panicked. He split his forces into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno would attack the southern end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen would sweep to the left and look for any escaping groups. Custer would take 5 companies, about 210 men, and swing north to strike the village from another angle. What Custer didn't tell Reno was that he expected Reno to do the hard part first, draw the warriors' attention, and then Custer would swoop in from the north and crush them between 2 forces. What Reno didn't know was that there were thousands of warriors in that village. At around 3 p.m. on June 25th, Major Reno led his 140 men down toward the southern end of the village. He crossed the Little Bighorn River and began advancing across an open plain toward the village. And then he saw how big the village actually was. Teepees stretched for miles. Warriors were pouring out to meet him. Women were grabbing children and running. The noise was overwhelming. War cries, horses, gunfire. Reno stopped. Instead of charging, he dismounted his men and formed a skirmish line in the open, which, strategically, was the worst possible thing to do when you're outnumbered 10-1. His men started taking fire almost immediately. One of his Arikra scouts, Bloody Knife, was shot in the head right next to Reno, and his blood and brain matter splattered across Reno's face. Reno broke. He ordered a retreat that almost immediately turned into a rout. Men were riding and running back toward the river as warriors cut them down. Soldiers drowned trying to cross. Some were killed mid-river. Some were shot off their horses climbing the bluffs on the other side. By the time Reno's surviving men scrambled to the top of the bluffs and dug in, he had lost about 40 men, nearly a third of his force. The survivors were in shock, disorganized, terrified, and they were waiting for Custer. They heard heavy gunfire to the north, where Custer had gone. For a brief moment, there was hope. Custer was attacking. The plan was working. Then the gunfire stopped. It had lasted maybe 45 minutes. Here's the brutal truth. We don't know exactly what happened to Custer's battalion. Everyone who rode with him died. The native warriors who fought them gave various accounts over the years, but memories differ. Time distorts things, and there were thousands of people involved. What archaeology, forensics, and the most credible warrior testimonies tell us is this. Custer led his 5 companies north along the ridge above the river, probably looking for a place to cross and attack the northern end of the village. What he didn't realize, or underestimated, was that by this point, Reno's attack had already failed, and now hundreds, possibly thousands, of warriors were free to redirect their attention northward. 2 massive flanking movements happened almost simultaneously. Crazy Horse, the legendary Oglala Lakota war leader, led one group swinging around to cut off any retreat. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota war chief whose own family had been killed in the opening moments of Reno's attack, led another group charging up the slope directly at Custer's men. Custer's force was split, overwhelmed, and surrounded within minutes. The fighting on what became known as Last Stand Hill was brief and catastrophic. Soldiers were shooting horses to use as cover, a sign of absolute desperation. Some soldiers likely broke and ran, only to be cut down in the ravines below. Archaeological evidence from the 1980s, when a brush fire exposed the battlefield and allowed for a systematic survey, showed that the soldiers' defensive line collapsed quickly. Cartridge cases were scattered in ways that suggested men were fleeing, not holding a line. Custer himself was found with 2 gunshot wounds, one in the left temple, one in the left chest. His body was relatively undisturbed compared to many others. Some warrior accounts suggest he was recognized and left somewhat intact as a form of respect, or simply as a practical decision. Other accounts suggest no one knew who he was until later. His younger brother Tom was with him. So was his brother-in-law. Several officers he'd known for years. All dead within the span of less than an hour. The last man standing? Nobody knows. When word reached the rest of America, arriving almost perfectly timed with the country's centennial celebrations on July 4, 1876, the reaction was shock, fury, and grief. And then, almost immediately, mythology. Newspapers ran dramatic accounts. Artists painted heroic scenes. Custer was reimagined as a noble martyr who died defending civilization against savage hordes. Elizabeth Custer spent 57 years, until her own death in 1933, writing books and giving lectures that preserved this image of her husband as a hero who was failed by his subordinates. Reno and Benteen were blamed, questioned, court-martialed in some cases. The real story, that Custer had ignored orders, refused reinforcements, split his force irrationally, and sent Reno into a situation without telling him what he was walking into, was buried under layers of myth. Meanwhile, the victory at Little Bighorn actually backfired terribly for the native nations. The American public, outraged and humiliated, supported an even more aggressive military campaign. Within a year, most of the tribes involved had been forced onto reservations. Crazy Horse was killed in custody in 1877. Sitting Bull eventually surrendered in 1881 and was killed by Indian police in 1890. The land they had fought for, the Black Hills, was seized by the U.S. government. The Supreme Court in 1980 ruled that this seizure was illegal and offered financial compensation. The Lakota refused the money. They wanted the land back. They still do. As of today, that unclaimed settlement, with over a century of compound interest, is worth more than $1 billion. The Lakota refused to touch it because accepting the money would mean accepting that the land is gone. The Battle of the Little Bighorn gets remembered as Custer's last stand, and that framing is everything. It makes the whole thing about one man, one military defeat, one dramatic and tragic afternoon on a Montana hillside. But zoom out, and it's something else entirely. It's the story of a government that broke a treaty the moment gold was discovered. It's the story of people defending their homes, their families, their sacred land against an army sent specifically to take it from them. It's the story of how America, when it lost that battle, doubled down and eventually took everything anyway. The warriors who fought that day, Gaul, Crazy Horse, the thousands of men and women who held that camp, they won. Tactically, militarily, undeniably. They defeated one of the most famous military units in American history, and they still lost everything. That's the part that doesn't make it into most textbooks. That's the part that gets glossed over when we talk about Custer's heroic last standard. That's the horror that lives underneath the myth. Custer was reckless and arrogant, and he got his men killed. That's true. But the real story of Little Bighorn is about what America was doing out there in the first place. All right, if you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you riding with me on this one. No pun intended. History is full of moments like this, where the story we were handed is real enough to feel true, but thin enough to hide the actual complexity underneath. Custer's last stand is one of the most famous events in American history, and most people still don't know the full picture. So here's what I want you to do. Not for me, for you. If something from this video surprised you, hit that like button. Not because it helps the algorithm. Okay, it does help the algorithm. But because it tells me you want more stories that go deeper than the textbook version. And if you're the kind of person who wants to be first in line when I drop the next one, Sitting Bull's full story, The Life of Crazy Horse, the Black Hills legal fight that's still going on today, then subscribe. The bell icon too, if you're feeling generous. Because here's the thing about history. The real stories, they're always more interesting, more complicated, and more haunting than the version you learned in school. And we're just getting started.